And we talked about it last night. And we're both fucking very confused. So, do your investigation. You fucking people spreading fucking rumors that they don't even know what the fuck they're talking about. Nor are they're speaking for people that like don't even have a problem. They're doing stuff that they shouldn't be doing. They should have talked to Void first, but they didn't. No worries, sorry Void. I just brought it up briefly. Pissed, a little pissed. That's all. All right, let's get started. All right, good night, Void. If you have anything that you would like to tell me, let me know. Just want to obey your boundaries and stuff. What happened? Am I okay? Not really. Not really. Not with this bullshit rumors going around that don't make any sense. Beep. Beep. Back to you. Beep. All right, let's get Chapter 3, Hunting Prey, the U.S. invasion of Panama. Historically treated as a U.S. possession and private, fiefdom. This is another word. Hold on, let me look at this word, make sure it's not a misspell. It's fiefdom. Okay. Fiefdom. Fiefdom. Private fiefdom. Panama has been invaded on no less than 11 occasions in the 20th century, 5 times between 1908 and 1925. Since Panama's nominal independence in 1903, it was functioned as a neo-colony of the United States and as a majority military base with a canal zone under U.S. jurisdiction. Panama is a black nation, black as political rather than a racial term, denotes the physiognomy, which we're going to look up right now because I have no idea what that is. Physiognomy, and I'm going to reread the whole thing again, but it's called physiognomy, and that is lots. Oh my gosh, switch it over. There you go. There's lots of definitions on this one. I think it's either using a noun, a person's facial features or expression, especially when regarded as indicative of character or ethnic origins. The other one is a supposed art. I don't think it's the art. And I think a general form of an appearance or something. That could be it, but it could be the first one. Hold on a second. I'll get the person up here in a minute. Let me just get back to my effects here. Taking for a little bit. Is my internet going okay? Okay. All right. And I'm going to give this person... I have lots of coins to give away. 400 to be honest. All right. I'm going to give 100 for this person real quick. There we go. Sweet. All right. Physiognomy. Can't say it right. Panama is a black nation. Black as a political rather than racial term. Denotes the physiognomy of its, quote, they use color, but ed, citizenry, indigenous, African, and I can't say this, they use the M word, mestiz, and I'm going to stop right there, Panamanians, and their constructions as second-class citizens. Of its 2.2 million inhabitants at the time of 1989, U.S. invasion, around 12% were indigenous, 13% African, 65% the M word, 8% European or white, and 2% other. Although they comprise less than 10% of the Panamanians' population, whites owned most of the country's land and economic resources. This oligarchy, with its ruling families entrenched and supported by the United States, as dominated Panamanian politics for most of this century. Panama's, oh my gosh, maybe it's Guan, no, it's Guilermo, Endar, a corporate lawyer, as one of the byproducts of the alliance between Panama's oligarchy and the United States. So that dude's a lawyer. In May 1989 elections, his party, the Alianza Democratica Civilistia, was financed by the United States at the price of $10 million. The Civilistias were described by nationalist Panamanians such as Isabel del Razono and a mestiza activist in El Frente and Unión de, I can't say these words, Contra, oh my gosh, FUMCA, who is opposed to U.S. intervention as, quote, white with money with cradles of silver. They don't want to see us, quote, black people. Color, race, and caste in Panama, although different from U.S. Counterparts, show some similarities in terms of disenfranchised peoples. A form of apartheid was practiced by the U.S. military in the Canal Zone. Until the late 1960s, racism in Panama, dominated by European ruling families and the U.S. military, mirrors the racism of the United States as symbolized by the whites only sign, which is past decades were widely visible in the Canal Zone. Panamanian nationalism and resistance have also echoed U.S. civil rights struggle. 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 Panamanians fought back. 21 people were overwhelmingly the majority of whom were Panamanian youths were killed and 450 wounded. By 1989, white and people and the color with the ED sign were no longer displayed on entrances, swimming pools, and drinking fountains, just as they had disappeared in the United States. But older Panamanians still remembered them in 1989, pointing out to the visitors the gates and doorways that display the apartheid laws. The extent to which racial codes have changed in Panama largely depends on the wealth of the individual citizen. Isabel del Razunio explains, quote, "Before the private schools were all white. Today, if you have money, even if your child is black, you can attend," end quote. Still, color and race factored into political democracy. In the Canal Zone, black Panamanians still face economic and racial discrimination from the U.S. Southern Command. They also confront discrimination from the present oligarchy. War against drugs. In September 1994, exceeding Undar's President Ernesto Perez Baladar's pardoned several hundred people associated with criminal activities of General Noriega. Some media maintained that the elections of the Beladars was proof that the United States invasion had led to the democratic process. Others emphasized that the State Department's war on drugs was successful because of Noriega is now serving in 40-year prison sentence in the United States. Yet according to Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA officials, the amount of drug trafficking and money laundering in Panama is indeterminate before the invasion and remains so today. This second objective, to stop the drug flow into the United States, was problematized by the New York Times also in October 1994 with another article on Panama's former dictator. Quote, lawyer of Noriega says he was paid $10 million to spy for U.S., end quote. Noting that the U.S. prosecutors were able to convict Noriega by arguing that his personal wealth stemmed from drug profiteering. The article report that previously concealed information made public in an appeal brief filed on September 13, 1994, stating that although CIA admitted to paying, quote, the former Panamanian dictator $160,000 for political favors, the defense claimed that Noriega had paid more than $10 million for supporting the Nicaraguan Contra and the Salvadorian government during its death squad era, end quote. A12. Noriega allegedly received an additional $2 million for caring for the Shah of Iran, S-H-A-H, Shah, I think, of Iran, who was dosed in 1979. The appeal lawyers accused the trial President Judge, Federal District Judge William H. Hovelair for determining the defense by denying Noriega the ability to offer evidence of something other than drug trafficking as the source of his wealth. A year before the invasion, in December 1988, the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee report, Drugs, Law Enforcement, and Foreign Policy, described the employment of Manuel Noriega as, quote, one of the most serious foreign policy failures for the United States, end quote. The invasion of Panama and the seizure of Noriega were carried out under the pretext of the American war, both national and international, against drugs, an interpretation that most media sources to this day relate uncritically. It is worth looking at the nature of that war more closely. Criticisms of the effectiveness of measures to reduce domestic drug consumption and the militarization of the anti-drug campaign were noted in the media. For example, in domestic financing of the war on drugs, 1/3 of Bush's funding were to rehabilitation. Only 2/3 went to policing. What is rarely examined, however, is whether the drug war was indeed effective and whether its primary objective was to discourage drug use. At the time of the Panamanian invasion, the United States was attempting to organize a military force in Peru, Bolivia, and Colombia into an army directed by the United States, ostensibly for drug enforcement. Yet, according to the senior U.S. official in Lima, anti-drug efforts in central Peru were unsuccessful, and winning the drug war in Latin America was not possible. But such criticisms miss the point where these forces are in fact used in counterinsurgency wars and in masking low-intensity conflicts. For example, the anti-communist and the anti-insurgency nature of the drug wars in the Andean countries has led to attack on M19 in Colombia and on the Shining Path in Peru. Revolutionary groups noted for their armed struggles and their resistance to peasants growing coca leaves. There were also reports that the U.S. military routing guerrillas who provided protections to peasants from drug lords allowed the local military to take over this protections. Under the guise of eradicating drugs, the U.S. government could consolidate political, military, and economic hegemony by destabilizing progressive movements. Government agencies can also seek to profit from or control the formal economy of narco trafficking, as in the case of Oliver North and the CIA, who allegedly channeled the C1, the coke, I'm not going to finish it, to fund Noriega's Contras illegally once Congress had gutted their funding. Further, the U.S. state policy may seek to manipulate and capitalize on rather than destroying the drug trade, despite public policy statements. A May 23, 1995 report on National Public Radio describes how Mexico became the largest conduit for the C word, for the C drug, into the United States from Colombia, with its 1994 drug trade value at $30 billion, attempting to pass the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and seeking to increase the congressional comfort level with Mexico. The Clinton administration downplayed the drug trade and any related stories in the press that would problematize passing the trade treaty with Mexico. American media sources played a significant role in shaping popular perceptions of the war on drugs and legitimacy of invasion and the nature of heroic militarism. Drug trafficking is a multinational corporate business run by corporate leaders, cartels, bank launderers, people who own private fleets, and police who monitor traffic and enforcement. Yet these affluent and powerful leaders are rarely perceived as culpable, even with sporadic press accounts, such as a November 21st, 1994 article in the New York Times. In it, Alan Marison reported that American Express Bank International agreed to pay a $32 million fine for laundering money for Mexico's largest drug cartel and channeling the C drug into the United States. Mass media representations of drug users and pushers are overwhelmingly Black, Latino, Chicano, racialized the war on drugs and the policing of it inside and outside U.S. borders. Although a considerable portion of drug trade profits accrue to wealthy companies such as American Express or, quote, shadow government agencies such as the CIA, there is little insight into the covert nature of the drug trade, criminality, and profiteering. Attempts to reestablish U.S. control over Panama can be traced back almost a quarter of a century to Richard Nixon's 1971 declaration that the war on drugs was a national emergency. Nixon named Manuel Noriega, then head of the Panamanian Security, as instrumental in the drug trade. In May 1971, John Ingersoll, director of the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, drafted a plan which broached assassinations of worldwide clandestine law enforcement. The alleged White House plan to assassinate both Noriega and National's Panamanian head of state, General Omar Torrijos Herrera, was squashed. By then, the Watergate scandal had begun to break. But the rhetoric of the Nixon administration was to be invoked. Nearly two decades later, in the Bush administration, rationalization for Operation Just Cause, the State Department code name for the invasion of Panama. The rationale for Panama's invasion was a law enforcement response to drug trafficking as necessary for mobilizing congressional and popular support. As such, it should be closely scrutinized. First, it should be reiterated that Noriega had worked with the CIA since 1960s. Then, as a cadet at the Peruvian Military Academy, he had provided information on left-wing students to the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency. For nearly 3 decades, he regularly reported to the U.S. government and the CIA. He also became a key asset in the U.S. war against Nicaragua, allowing the Contras to train the Coimba Islands off Panama when direct U.S. military support to them was prohibited. Moreover, journalists have reported U.S. agencies' involvement with organized crime and drug trafficking since just after the Second World War. Records of the 1986 executive session of the Iran-Contra hearing have shown that covert operations to fund the Contras were intertwined with drug trafficking on a large scale. As Senator John Kerry put it in one session of the hearing, quote, "It is clear that there is a networking of drug trafficking through the Contras, and in the name of national security, we can produce specific law enforcement officials who will tell you that they have been called off drug trafficking investigations because the CIA is involved. The U.S. government's failure to prosecute any of its agencies or agents involved in drug trafficking problematized the rationale of the invasion as law enforcement. In fact, the government sought to enforce under the guise of its anti-drug rhetoric Panamanian compliance with U.S. regional policies in Central America." Gonna look back a little bit, everybody. Hey, Avery. Just looking back, I finally looked down and saw all this. Oh, look. Paul came in. Huh. Look at that. I wonder if he knows what the fuck's going on, too. Anyways, back to the reading. America controlled the Panama had begun to unravel with the 1968 coup that brought Torrijos. I tried. I said Torrijos, but I don't know how to say it. To power the unsettled, Anarfulio Arias Madrid, Andars Monitor, and the member of the oligarchy. That's a name. Arias, Arias, had dominated Panamanian politics up to that time by merging nationalism with ethnic chauvinism and a form of socialism. Domestically, I'm going to start this bit. Torrijos economic and land reforms dismantled the hegemony of the Panamanian white oligarchy. Indigenous, African, and the M word that I can't use, Panamanians began to make substantial gains in education, health, housing, and employment. New hospitals, health centers, houses, schools, and universities were built. More doctors, nurses, and teachers were trained. In just under 2 decades, infant mortality declined from 40% to 19.4%. Life expectancy increased by more than 9 years. Indigenous communities were granted autonomy and protection for their traditional lands. Foreign policy under that person's name, Torrijos, I can't say it right, sorry everybody, was just as radical a break with the past. His policies of Panamanian sovereignty over the canal and military bases and the regular contact and exchange of information with the Cuban government directly threatened U.S. hegemony in Central America and contradicted U.S. regional policies, increasing Panamanian nationalism and protest, including, I can't say this person's word, I'm going to try, Torrijos' threat to blow up the canal lock if the United States did not comply led to the signing of the Panama Canal Treaty in Washington, D.C. on September 7th, 1977 by President Carter. Gonna look back. Under this treaty, the canal and all military bases were to be transferred to Panama by the year 2000. Unsurprisingly, the treaty was extremely unpopular with U.S. conservatism. What place Torrijos, I can't say the name, Torrijos, and later Noriega on U.S. assassination list has not the alleged criminality of their governments, but their circumvention of U.S. policy in Panama and the region, a policy marked at anti-communist racism and intervention under the guise of the war on drugs. Omar Torrijos died in 1981 in a mysterious plane crash, which a former Panamanian army officer later attributed to the CIA. In addition, accordingly to Amnesty International, in June 1987, Colonel Robert Days Herrera, second in command in the Panamanian Defense Forces and a close relative to Torrijos, accused Noriega of election fraud, political murder, and plotted with the CIA to assassinate Torrijos. I can't say the name, I'm so sorry. As in most political assassinations, such claims are rarely substantiated. What is easily discernible, however, is the fact that the reform of people's power movements developed during the Torrijos regime were blocked. Noriega eventually became the de facto head of state. With the ultimately death of Torrijos and the change in the Panamanian government, the progressive reforms of the 1970s came to a halt. Despite the corruption of Noriega government, however, the number of Torrijos policies were allowed to continue. For example, benefits such as the mandatory Social Security vacation time, a bonus of 1 month's pay each year, insurance, and labor code remained largely intact. Race, class, and destabilization. Interesting. And again, if anybody wants to get voids on this, yeah. Sorry. Race, class, and destabilization. In 1987 invasion was the culmination of the American economic war against Panama. The standard of living of majority of Panamanians have already begun to drop from the mid-1980s onwards as a result of International Monetary Fund austerity programs implemented by President Nicolas Borletta, who was elected in 1984. On the October 9th, in an October 9th, 1994 article that legitimized the invasion, the New York Times noted that more than 50% of Panamanians lived in poverty, with official unemployment at 14%. Government revenues before the invasion were down to 45% because the punitive U.S. policy towards Panama. For instance, the United States paid neither its assessments for using the canal. The treaty called for U.S. payments of $10 million each year of services, nor fees garnered by the canal. American businesses were prohibited from paying Panamanian taxes, and ships bearing the Panamanian flag were denied access to U.S. ports. From 1987, economic sanctions and embargoes caused great hardships. Malnutrition began to develop among children, particularly in the countryside, where land distribution programs were rendered ineffectual. Panamanian working class people who had acquired land in the 1960s and 1970s lacked the resource of cultivating it. In the canal zone, Panamanians employed by the United States were more financially secure, yet radical discrimination meant that most of these Panamanian workers held low-paying maintenance jobs. 2 years of sanctions from 1987 to 1989 led to a 25% drop in economic production and rising unemployment. In an interview in Panama City on November 1989 with a representative of the 60,000 member Federation of Workers of the Republic of Panama. An estimated 30% of unionized workers were in its ranks. Members explained that unemployment increased from 10% to 11% in 1987, to 11% to 16% in 1988, and they projected it at 17.5% for 1989. Poverty rose steeply. Before 1987, 33% of the population lived below poverty line. In 1988, 40.2%, 44% by 1989, and 50% by 1995. Increasingly, trade unionists also grappled with union busting. According to the Federation, as the embargoes took effect, unemployment grew, unions were weakened or destroyed. Collective bargaining was suspended, and campaigns were initiated against trade unions officials. Until the conflict with Noriega, the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organization, AFL-CIO, officially supported the Federation's Institute of Free Labor Development. According to the Federation representatives, as the crisis developed in Panama, union was told to protest in the streets against Noriega or lose its economic support from the AFL-CIO. Union leaders refused to thus lost financial backing. Rural workers fared no better than city workers. By 1989, production was down 50% as agricultural workers lacked from machinery, fertilizers, and resources derived from petroleum, which Panama does not produce. As with Cuba, the U.S. embargoes and economic sanctions prohibited the importation of fertilizers from the United States and Europe, and the expropriation of agricultural products like beef and sugar to the United States. Panamanian small-scale farmers faced increasing hardships with the embargoes, as did rural indigenous communities. As Peter Harthy explains, indigenous rights to autonomous land control and special government assistance, which had been granted under Torrijos, continued and varied in varying degrees under the administration of General Ruben Dario Paredes and Noriega. Political unrest and economic restraint in Panama since mid-1987 hindered government assistance to maintain rural indigenous land. Before the U.S. embargoes, indigenous workers moved to Panama City in search of jobs. In the aftermath of the war, urban indigenous populations are returning to their traditional lands for economic self-sufficiency. Their economic autonomy is now threatened by militarists, real estate developers, and government encroachment on their land. Women, national crisis, and nationalist resistance. Rather, in the urban or rural areas, the economic crisis has continued to be borne most heavily by black women. Women workers in Panama, as in the United States, were primarily segregated in low-paying service sectors, jobs as domestic cleaners, store clerks, manual workers, and office workers. American sanction aggravated the situation of thousands of female-headed households. Malnutrition and starvation had been steadily increasing among the Panamanian poor. El Frente Unido de Mujeres contra el Agreso, FUMCA, sorry everybody, was formed in July 1987 in response to the U.S. economic destabilization of Panama. In this sense, it was a nationalist women's group challenging U.S. interventionist policies. The coalition was composed of 22 community-based women's organizations by 1989. At its March 8th, 1989 National Congress in Panama City, on International Women's Day, 3,000 women were addressed by Commander-in-Chief Noriega. Most FUMCA women were members of the, Partido Revolucionario Democrático, PRD, known as the Party of Torrijos and Noriega. The leadership of the FUMCA was described as organizations as the Fronte Feminini of the PRD, and at the time a party of the military workers, feminists, students, and intellectuals. As party of progressive and conservative nationalists with different economic and political agendas, it was held together by the internal threat of U.S. intervention. According to FUMCA, women had the most to lose under the Yangquan Pact, that militarized Panamanian resources and placed them under foreign management. The economic effects of the intervention were clear. For example, FUMCA reported a minimum wage of at 75 cents per hour, with women earning an average of $50 million a month. U.S. currency is the paper currency of Panama, with a maximum of $450. Milk costs 65 cents a carton, a loaf of bread 45 cents. Because of the embargoes and sanctions, construction virtually stopped. The resulting housing shortage meant rising rent, overcrowded housings, and increased renter migration, all disruptions of family life. But the invasion, FUMCA had organized around Panama, national defense, and its effect on the political and economic rights of women. It had also attempted without success to establish contact with women in the opposition and the Canal Zone. Fewer reportedly answered the call through FUMCAS's national radio program to form a women's front against foreign intervention. Race and class division and privilege of Silavista women, as well as ideological differences in terms of government, all worked to mitigate coalitions among Panamanian women. The organization also opposed the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, which, according to then Treasurer Isabel I'm doing my best, Risonio, aligned itself with the oligarch, urging women to demonstrate against Noriega's government by banging pots in the street, as middle-class women had in the CIA-sponsored overthrow of President Salvadorian Allende in Chile. Prior to the invasion, FUMCA collected and delivered clothes, food, and medicine to poor women and offered classes for women in physical and psychological self-defense in case of military attack. By 1989, the U.S. military presence in Panama, some 13,000 troops were routinely sanctioned there, had also increased sexual exploitation and violence against women. American troops provided the base for prostitution industry in Panama. I'm gonna look back a little bit. Yeah. Happy Halloween, Vaughn. According to the FUMCA, the racial and sexual violence against indigenous women by U.S. soldiers proved particularly severe. As Del Rosonio explained to me in an interview, quote, "Gringos would grape and kill women, but the U.S. Army would just ship them out rather than allow them to be tried as Panamanian courts. For decades, although maintaining the right to jurisdictions and extradition over Panamanians, the United States never gave Panama jurisdictions over U.S. troops sanctioned in Panama. Some women nationalists wondered if the U.S. military never turned over any troops accused of raping or murdering Panamanian women by Panamanian women should turn Noriega over to the United States. Schmexual violence by foreign troops was only one of the problems that Panamanian women, particularly poorer and darker skinned women, had to confront. Among the other difficulties facing women, FUMCA identify a large percentage of female-headed households and adolescents without jobs, nourishment, pensions, as the only subsistence for large numbers of children, women's exploitation in the labor market, and the fact that the weight of the economic crisis was borne most heavily by women. In response, FUMCA made specific demands on the government, including Social Security as a right, the abolition of work codes that undermine workers' rights and wages, the expansion and development of family laws with community input, publicly supported programs for children and pregnant women in poverty, full health rights, the adjustments of economic crisis without cutting service to women workers, collective decisions making between government agencies and community groups, and the increased roles of women in government leadership. The policy proposal of FUMCA were not well received by the American-installed Endara government. After the invasion, many FUMCA women were reportedly fired from their jobs and went underground or into detention camps, according to Esmeralda Brown, coordinator of the New York-based women's workshop in the Americas, a sister organization to FUMCA. Members of the FUMCA had also begun to develop a form of national and international policies, working with the German Democratic Republic-based Women's International Democratic Federation and the Cuban-based Fratina Continental del Mayoris contra la this is all, I think, in Spanish, I can't say it, formed in Cuba at the 1988 Centro. Sorry, everybody. The regional and international perspective of FUMCA and its stance against U.S. intervention in Latin America set it at odds with the conservative Andorra government. U.S. militarism in Central America. Here we go. Gonna look back a bit. I'm a bit upset today, everybody, to be honest. I'm a bit fucking livid right now. I'll be honest with you. I'll be fucking honest with you. And if anybody wants to talk to me about the shit that's going around that Moxie is saying, please fucking talk to me. U.S. militarism in Central America. The United States routinely violated the Panama Canal Treaty in acts prohibited by international law and the U.S. Constitution. The Torrijos-Carter Treaty banded the us of the U.S. military outside of the protection of the canal. Yet in January 1985, 1986, and 1987, the U.S. military, the Panamanian Defense Forces, engaged in joint military exercises unrelated to canal security in Panama. From 1987 until the invasion, no U.S. military operation had been coordinated with the Joint Panamanian Commission, although the Torrijos-Carter Treaty called for such cooperation. Uncoordinated U.S. military flights and sea operations jeopardized commercial Panamanian flights and damaged the fishing industry. On land, U.S. soldiers freely harassed Panamanians with military maneuvers in neighborhoods and city districts. Such operations often obstructed traffic for hours in commercial districts in downtown Panama City. Psychological warfare against the population and invasion training exercise left an estimated 20 U.S. troops dead before the invasion of September 20th, 1989. Troops died not in confrontation with Panamanians, but in combat exercises or friendly fire. The FUMCA nationalist women rarely commented in 1989 that U.S. troops, quote, crashed and exploded, and no one is confronting them. Bombs exploded on base. They fought with the coconut tree, and it resulted in 3 deaths, end quote. Panama was strategically important for the U.S. war against Nicaragua. Then, under the Sandinista government, but under Noriega, Panama became a member of the Condora Group, which sought the resolution to the Contra War. In 1985, U.S. National Security Advisor John Poindexter met with Noriega in the unsuccessful attempt to negotiate Panama departure from the group. Poindexter requested, again unsuccessfully, the use of Panamanian defense forces for the southern front against Noriega. Vice President Bush also sought the reinstatement of Nicolas Barletta, a personal friend and former student of Secretary of State George Shultz, as president of Panama. Late in 1985, Noriega had helped to organize the dismissal of Barletta, who was elected in 1984 amid accusations of electoral fraud by Panamanian Defense Force. The Panamanian government refused these and other requests of violations of Panama sovereignty. Nonetheless, as the congressional hearing on the Iran-Contra affair in autumn 1986 showed, quote, the U.S. Southern Command located in the zone played a major role in coordination, intelligence gathering, and delivery of supplies to the U.S.-funded counter-revolutionary attempts to overthrow the Nicaraguan government, end quote. El Salvador's war was a factor as well. Air bases and listening posts in the zones, according to John Wicks and Andrew Zimbalist's analysis of the U.S. military role in Panama, were significant factors in the civil war in El Salvador. And in the November 1989 FMLN offensive against the Salvadorian government, hospital administered by the U.S. military in Panama were used to service wounded Salvadorian soldiers. Another objective on the invasion, downplayed by most media reports, was the removal of Noriega from economic profiteering, which supported nations that the United States opposed. Noriega not only dragged his feet in the Contra War, but he also provided Panama free trade zones in Colón for the duty-free shipment of goods for Cuba and Nicaragua, thereby circumventing the U.S. trade embargoes. On March 26, 1987, letters from Assistant State Department Secretary J.E. Fox and Senator Jesse Helms illustrated how the Reagan administration viewed Noriega as countering U.S. interests. And this is what they say, I think it's the U.S. State Department. The State Department shares your views that when the Carter Torrijos treaties are being renegotiated, and prolongation of the U.S. military presence in Panama Canal area till well after the year 2000 should be brought up for discussion. The continuing power of the Sandinistas and the Nicaraguan, the activities of the Salvadorian insurgents, and the influence of communist Cuba in the region make it urgently necessary for the United States to strengthen its position in Central America. Of course they think that. The continuing polarization of political forces in Panama may lead to the crisis in the country, which would pose a serious threat to stability in the region. You're right, stability my ass. All right, what do we got? Who's saying this? Yes, U.S. has been awesome. Yeah, U.S. BRICS is still a bit of a social imperialist thing. The letter went on to call for steps, quote, to bring about the resignation of General Noriega and to set up an interim government, end quote, that would safeguard, quote, U.S. strategic interests, end quote. In the view of a fact-finding delegation sponsored by Black veterans for social justice that visited Panama in September 1989, the Bush agenda would finally turn out to be, quote, a swap from the canal for long-term guaranteed U.S. based in Panama. And the crisis would be escalated, quote, until the Panamanian government renegotiates the Torrijos Charter Treaty and the U.S. presence in Panama becomes permanent, end quote. The usefulness of the bases after the invasion was demonstrated in the summer of 1994 when the United States, quote, hosted, end quote, or rather detained Cuban refugees in Panama camps following the mass exodus up from Cuba. Policymakers presented by the U.S. military presence in Panama as crucial for influence in the region. Within 1 month of the passing of Carter on Torrijos Treaty, presidential candidate Ronald Reagan warning of the potential loss of U.S. security and financial interests, campaigned for the oh my gosh, I can't do this word. Let me look up this word real quick, everybody. I've been doing so well. Be right back. A-B... Abrogation. And that means to repeal or abolish of a law, right, or agreement. So trying to abolish that Panamanian treaty. Abrogation of the treaty. Under the provision of the treaty, December 8, 1989 proved a critical month in the progress towards Panamanian decolonization. Consequently, it was the mouth in which the United States escalated the war. Yeah, the month. Yeah. According to the treaty, as of December 31st, 1989, the Panamanian government was to establish its own appointee as head of the Panamanian Canal Commission. The commission chair was then to implement plans for the December 31st, 1999 transfer of the canal and all its property and assets, including military bases, to the Panamanian people. All U.S. bases are to cease operations in Panama by January 1st, 2000. But on December 4th, 1989, in clear violation of the treaty, President George Bush appointed his own nominee as head of the commission. One week later, the Panamanian National Assembly declared Panama in the state of war and named Noriega commander-in-chief of the armed forces as head of state. The U.S. State Department and major media routinely reported this as Panamanians' declaration of war against the United States. Days prior to the invasion, media reported Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney's statement that the military wife had been threatened by the Panamanian Defense Forces. What? Suggesting the provocation of military action. On December 6, 1989, a U.S. officer was killed in the confrontation with Panamanian Defense Forces. 4 U.S. officers and civilians dressed had entered a neighborhood that housed the Panamanian Command, where on October 3rd, a coup attempt had been made. Hold on a second. I have stuff for this person. There you go. That's all I got for right now. Well, that's not all I got. I'm just seeing them waiting. Since that date, the U.S. curfew prohibited its soldiers from entering Panamanian territory without authorization from the commanding officers. The account of the shooting given in American sources stated initially that the officers were unarmed, but the Panamanian government maintained that they were armed and that the U.S. officers had opened fire first, shooting a woman, child, and elderly man. The compound, of course, we're gonna, take up. 2 days after this incident, on September 18th, a U.S. soldier who repeatedly felt threatened shot Panamanian police officer who approached to question him in the laundromat. 2 days later, the United States invaded. The invasion. On December 20th, 1989, following the long history of U.S. intervention, came the last U.S. invasion in Panama. General Noriega was ousted and taken back to the United States to stand trial for drug charges, and opposition leader Andorra was installed as president. The invasion of Panama was at that time the largest military operation since the Vietnam War, involving some 36,000 troops, which the largest parachute drop since the Second World War. For weeks, the United States had been mobilizing troops at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. Congress, however, was informed of the attack only hours beforehand. In one sense, the invasion was the last resort. Following the failures of the U.S.-backed opposition parties, despite the millions of dollars invested in them, to challenge the Panamanian government seriously and the failure of the U.S.-backed coups, the most recent of which occurred on July 3rd. But the invasion was not the bloodless walkover that the State Department portrayed it to be. Civilian neighborhoods were carpet bombed. The Dignity battalions, nationalists, pro-government paramilitary squads developed by Noriega after October 3rd coup attempt put up a strong resistance despite being inadequately armed. While the State Department claimed some 3 weeks after the invasion that civilian casualties numbered just 200. The Spanish language press, both within and outside the United States, included the Inter-Press Service and Echo of Mexico cited more than 2,000 civilian deaths and approximately 70,000 military casualties. Initially, the Spanish press, El Diario, I can't say it right, and the African American press, Amsterdam News, and City Sun, the alternative media, WBAI-New York Public Radio, bothered to report Panamanian civilian casualties. New York City's El Diario carried photos and reportage of mass graves dug by the U.S. Army to conceal the actual death count. National Lawyers Guild returning from the fact-finding mission of Panama in early February 1990, and the Center for Constitutional Rights also reported the presence of mass graves. On September 27, 1989, the Wall Street Journal ran a story describing how the possibilities of a protracted guerrilla war, something that, according to the press reports 2 days after the invasion, the Pentagon and Southern Command had feared, was dispelled by the surrounding key Panamanian forces on December 26. The journal quoted U.S. trained Major Ivan Gaitan, I can't say it, who surrendered, I'm really bad at names, who surrendered a vital base. Quote, "I personally know the Americans quite well. They aren't going to put troops up against our guerrillas because they wouldn't put soldiers in another Vietnam. We feared they would simply bomb the hell out of our area." End quote. Media depictions of mostly adult male casualties obscured the realities of large number of children and women civilians injured or killed in the war. The bombing of Chirolosio and other poor neighborhoods left nearly 20,000 people homeless, food supplies scarce. American reports also obscured the fact that women were part of the national resistance, participating not only in the dignity battalions and did some children, but in the military as well. The base of the Instructicon Feminia Rufunia Alfurio, the women's military detachment, was named after Rufunia Alfurio. And I'm not great at these names. I suck at names. Oh my gosh. All right, I did it the second time. The women military detachment was named, the women who had the first call in 1821 for Panamanian independence and sovereignty from Spain, before the invasion in the neighborhood where Rufunia Alfurio was located. It's Alfurio, I can't do it, Alfaro is located. U.S. troops made several incursions in 1 week. Pointing artillery at homes and flying low over houses in helicopters is pre-dawn maneuvers. The women's military center was surrounded by a high fence, and across the street another fence was erected around the empty lot. On both fences and the front of the building were cloth banners in Spanish and English. Put there against harassing U.S. troops. One banner read, "Ahí qui mandu gringo, ja ja ja," or they're gonna say is, "Oh, what fear gringos, ha ha ha." Another in English read, "Don't forget Vietnam, damn straight." The Panama invasion revealed a further adaptation of military technology to low-intensity conflicts against developing world countries. Although such conflicts usually involved proxy soldiers, Contras, and mercenaries, and in this case, U.S. troops and the Pentagon were directly involved. Soon after the invasion, U.S. News and World Report quotes General Edward Myers, former Army Chief of Staff, quote, "This is the first time in the new post-Cold War era world there has been an operation by any country where a mixture of conventional and unconventional forces was used in measured way against the type of threat the U.S. will face in the future. The Panama operations outlined the rationale for the type of forces we will acquire," end quote. The type of forces required revealed an obsession with high-tech militarization. The Pentagon used eight $50 million F-1117A stealth fighters to drop 2,000-pound bombs on the communication site near Rio Hato, maybe. Initially, the Pentagon reported that the bombs were dropped in an open field, causing no injuries. Weeks later, new reports stated that the stealth bombers had also hit communication centers in Panama City. To patrol the cities, the 7th Light Infantry Division trained in urban warfare. Used night vision equipment developed in the 1980s, allowing soldiers to see the shot in the dark. Stun guns were also used. In the words of former Chief of the Southern Command, General Frederick Warner, quote, "Low-intensity conflicts does not mean simplistic equipment. In the developing world, conflicts and the importance of sophistication increases rather than decreases, since you're dependent on the more precise and more massive application of force." Assholes. After the invasion, Panama was policed by the Southern Command. During the post-invasion months, the U.S. government and major media reported that approximately 5,300 Panamanians were being detained for questioning in camps. Progressive activists cited higher features. figures. On January 19th, 1990, New York Times articles, quote, U.S. is releasing invasion captives, end quote, failed to note that after releasing some Panamanians, the United States rearrested or detained them. Detainees were held without charge. More than a year after the invasion, the names of prisoners had not been released. America Watch, a human rights organization, report U.S. violation of Geneva Convention Accords on the treatment of prisoners and the denial of basic rights to due process and punitive detentions. Because the United States has never declared war in Panama, those incarcerated were not referred to as prisoners of war, but as detainees. If someone's name appears on the list, the United States has already developed a list of some 6,000 government employees, civilians, educators, and nationalists who were prohibited entry into the United States. Then he or she could have been picked up and detained without charge. The Times recounted the story of one Panamanian doctor who, after receiving a telephone call to go to the local police station for questioning, was arrested by U.S. troops upon his arrival and flown by Army helicopter to the Empire Range detention camps. In 1990, the Center for Constitutional Rights filed a suit, Salas versus United States, SALAS versus United States, on the behalf of the families of the 272 Panamanian civilians. In 1993, the Inter-American Commission of the Organizations of American States agreed to hear the cases on the basis of international law violations and victim compensations. On the 5th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Panama, the center issued a 1994 update reported that Salas versus United States marks, quote, the first time in history that the United States was formally obliged to respond to civilian allegations of human rights violations due to armed interventions in Latin America, end quote. The suit was based on reports of 2,000 civilians were killed, 5,000 illegally incarcerated, 8,000 left homeless, an estimated billions of dollars in damages to personnel and business properties stemming from the 1989 bombing and invasion. The center reported in 1994 that 80% of those affected in the invasion were not returned to work, and malnutrition and self-unaliving have increased with women and children, the most adversely affected medically. Less critical assessments on the 5th anniversary of the invasion appeared in more affluential media sources. For instance, the New York Times October 1994 article, "In Panama, a New Day Arouses Old Soldiers," end quote, report that the two objectives for the invasion were to install the democratically elected government by disposing Noriega and to halt the flow of drugs into the United States via Panama. Media report not only shaped perceptions of the rationale for the invasion, they also influence social perception of the legitimacy of state violence waged against Panama. Valorizing state violence in U.S. media. I'm going to check this out. Hold on a second. Oh my God, dude, read the book. Read the book, people. Oh my God, the CIA documents is just an opinion talk, not a fact. Oh my God, fuck off. Completely fuck off. Completely fuck off. Let me see where I'm at, because I have like 20 minutes. 93. Okay. I think I could read the rest. Let's find. Yeah, I'll read the rest. 93. And then we'll be on a different part. Yeah. Valorizing state violence in the U.S. media. American media coverage of the invasion signifies overwhelming approval by both U.S. and Panamanian citizens. Bush's Democratic rise in the opinion polls was demonstrated on January 30th, 1990 by ABC, which ran its stories on the invasion under the title, quote, "From the Whip to the World-Class Leaders," end quote. It is unclear who was interviewed by New York Times, CBS, and Gallup pollsters in the United States or Panama. Consider the Panamanian polling. For example, the poll taken in January 1990 by CBS News stated that 92% of Panamanians interviewed approved of the invasion. What many news sources failed to report was that the interviews were conducted in affluent, largely white neighborhoods, probably the least hostile neighbors for U.S. news reporters in the wake of the bombing of poor, largely brown and black neighborhoods. The narrative, the fucking narrative. One of the most frightening assumptions promoted in major media coverage was the right of the U.S. government to attempt to assassinate the leaders of another country or regions. Most of the major networks unquestioningly reiterated the idea that assassinations are legitimate government operations and that invasion is a valid way of implementing them. Throughout the 5 hours of living coverage on December 20th, ABC News anchorman Peter Jennings presented the position that the problem of Panama was not the invasion of the sovereign nations to eliminate its heads of state and the bombing of civilian population. The public seems indifferent to this, given its passive reaction to Reagan's bombing of Libya. But that the, quote, hunt for Noriega, end quote, as Jennings describes it, was not immediately successful. Control over media coverage, it was strict. American journalists in the Pentagon pool, those flown into Panama by the Bush administration to cover the invasion, were restricted to U.S. military base during the first hour of the invasion, thus ensuring that there would be no coverage of the civilian casualties and bombings. Only the coverage of the bombings of Iraq several years later would exceed the restrictions. No other U.S. press outside the Pentagon pool of journalists were allowed into Panama, and a Spanish photographer who set photos of casualties to U.S. Spanish language papers was killed by U.S. troops in crossfires outside of tourist hotel. American media coverage of the invasion failed to question the U.S. assumptions of international jurisdictions over drug law enforcement as a pretext for violating its 1977 Panama Canal Treaty and Panamanian sovereignty, nor was the use of Panama as a military base for U.S. intervention a Central America examined critically. Although there were critics of the invasion as well as anti-war and anti-interventions demonstrations, the failure of mainstream institutions to raise concern combined with the favor of patriotic nationalism curtailed resistance to U.S. anti-Panamanian violence. Part of the general acquiescence of the state forced stemmed from the media protections of racial obsession. Racism in reports to the invasion was constant. The Newsweek Newsweek's January 5th, 1990 issues, Frederick Kemp described Noriega at the time of his surrender and arrest as, quote, a whipped and beaten. They use little and a mere shadow of the machete waving gringo hating dictators, end quote. The use of sexist imagery to support the invasion was also revealed in Bush's pronouncements that the United States invaded to save American lives and American womanhood. Or, as Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney phrased it, the Panamanian Defense Force, racialized brown. Radicalized. Is it radicalized? No, it's racialized. There's no D. Had sexually threatened the military wives. Racialized white. Ew. In contrast, the United States was not invading El Salvador or Guatemala or attacking the Contras to safeguard American lives. Although those governments and the Contras have been responsible for the deaths of U.S. citizens as well as sexual assaults on and the political torture of American women and religious and peace activists, perhaps no reports revealed the convergence of classism, racism, and sexism that shaped the invasion and its representation better than Kemp's articles. According to Kemp, quote, Noriega continued, survival blemished Bush anti-drug efforts and underlined increased American impotence in the region. Kemp described Noriega as a, quote, two-bit intelligence chief from a banana and bank republic, end quote. His depiction of Bush's December 1979 meeting with Noriega when Bush was a CIA director, subtitled, quote, Boley versus Brumman, is revealing. Here it is. I think this is it right here. Two intelligent chiefs contrast in the style of substance. Bush was lanky and refined, raised by Burman, New England family. A Burman, New England family. He towered over the 5'5" Noriega. Noriega was mean streets. I'm not going to say the M word. As bastard son of his father's domestic, Noriega offered his usual damp, limp, shaking handshake to Bush. Bush firm grip. They were clearly uncomfortable with each other. Sanitizationalized as the safari hut, with international law and state violence treated as no more than a factor in the gang between the romanticized hunter and the animalized hunted. The invasion of Panama and the devastating effects on its people, democratic law and policies were trivialized. Conclusion. And this is and this will be about a paragraph and a half. State Department and media information, or more accurately, disinformation, set the stage for rationalized the invasion of Panama. Nationalism and racism provide the symbolism for violence in U.S. foreign policies. The invasion carried the marking of symbolic outrage at Noriega's criminality, state protective concerns for U.S. personnel and families, and contempt for so-called banana republics. The confluence of such national sentiments allowed a military intervention to unfold with little significant domestic resistance, like the threats of communism and terrorism, quote, narco-terrorism, end quote, provided the apology for U.S. state violence. The public's voluntary ignorance of the Canal Treaty, drug trafficking, and the U.S. employment of Noriega allowed the circumvention of repressive and racist practice of militarization. As the Center of Constitutional Rights notes in its update on the 5th anniversary of the invasion, as usual, women and children bear much of the brunt of war. Before 1989 invasion, FUMCS's organization pamphlet, Porque los mayores somos parte del Estu Lachu, I don't know how to say that, sorry everybody, maintained that defending national sovereignty was part of women's political history in Panama, citing among other things Rafunia Alfiero, a woman's leadership in the popular power movements in the 1960s and 1970s. The FUMCA pamphlet stressed that the conditions of women's lives demanded activism. Quote, half the population realize that foreign aggression threatens the stability of their homes and their children's future, end quote. And at the November 1989 conference attended by U.S. educators, the political and religious leaders, Panamanian women, warned how deadly U.S. policy in Panama was and made this plea to U.S. women. Quote, there are many U.S. women whose children are here, and they do not know what they are doing or what the U.S. government is doing. We're trying to bring about a rebirth of our culture, and they, the U.S. government, are thinking of killing our people, end quote. During hunts and assassinations, invasions and bombings, protections is the justifying logic of U.S. violence directed at its external threats. In this case, nations and peoples who constituted the other in the American mind. Violence, however, bled across borders. It migrates with, this is another one. I'm going to look this up. And I'll reread it again. As soon as it lets me, there it goes. I'll be right back. Got another word. It's mercurial. And this is the definition of it. A lot of persons subject to sudden or unpredictable changes of mood or mind. That's the objective. Noun, a drug or of the containing of element mercury. That's not it. A drug or other compound contained in I think it's the first. Definitely the first. If people disagree, let me know. Definitely the first. Hey, look, it's not Pot Capri. Look at that. Fluidity in an unpredictability that cannot be easily contained once deployed. In May 1995, in the wake of various armed assaults on the presidential mansions and its guards by U.S. citizens attempt to exercise their right to assassination, the White House took the unprecedented action and permanently closed Pennsylvania Avenue to the public. And that's the end. And we'll start at it says colors of Eros. Cuba as American obsession. Ooh, interesting. That's going to be interesting. U.S. destabilization of Cuban resistance. Ooh, that's going to be fun, I think. Okay. All right. I'm going to stop here. No, it's 10 minutes early, but if I go further, I'll probably go too far over. All right. Start the next thing tomorrow. I think it's not tomorrow. I think it's the next day that Lynn comes in. One day I'm gonna have to do no reading one day to go pick up Lynn from the train station. So that will happen. We ended at 97. All right, we ended at 97. All right, the panel's open. Anybody that wants to come up and talk about it, you're welcome up.
Hello.
Hey, what's up?
Doing good.
Think I know what it's about. I think I know what it's about, Benny. I think I know what it's about. Yeah, I think I know what it's about. Yeah, no surprise. All right, what's up?
Oh, yeah. You, you were doing good.
Yeah? What do you have to say about this? Do you have any things you want to add?
Um, Nothing really. It was all just placed out.
It's amazing how they run these things in order to safeguard the American public of what exactly do, and the fact that they didn't let the journalists to go out, and they unalived journalists that were out there to safeguard their freaking atrocities towards women, children, and other people, and to come back and say, well, only this much, we were successful and we were precise, when actually knowing that it was a huge bloodbath and there was huge like evidence of the fact and the denial still of those things of that.
Sounds familiar.
Like the United States really safeguards its population into believing that we're doing things for democracy, we're doing to safeguard our way of life and our culture. You know what I mean? Really bringing that in as a propaganda flank. It's like, yeah, this is justified, without even actually looking in and doing things, you know?
What culture?
Yep.
The culture of erasure. But sounds familiar, don't you think?
Yeah, always familiar. They always run the same program.
Yeah.
Maybe slight differences and better development, of course, because now I see that the United States and their way of being able to disregard their atrocities, that, like they mentioned, that they fund groups that will do the interest of the United States economically. So what they'll do is they'll fund and have people train things, and then they'll train people here like they've done. I don't know if they still do that. Maybe they do train people and then put them into power, and then they do. Yeah. So it's just the same thing. You know what I mean? So
Yeah, they definitely have a playbook. Like, they do things differently, but they have a playbook that they play by.
yeah, and you're right. Like, we don't get to see the atrocities that women and children, the most vulnerable. We've seen it in Sudan, in the Congo, and in Palestine, of course. We're seeing all those, or wherever these G-sides are happening too, because there's more than just those ones. We do see that the effects of those things, and in war, mostly target like women and children a lot more. So, yeah, it helped me to re-examine that and to remember that, you know? All right.
Yeah. That's all I came up to say.
No worries. I'm going to go ahead and drop.
Yep.
And I appreciate you. I appreciate everybody else.
right.
I might come back.